Prince William and Princess and just executed what might honestly be the most ruthless, perfectly calculated institutional takeover in modern royal history. And Queen Camilla apparently never saw a single second of it coming until the exact moment her sister's front door was aggressively knocked on by a high court enforcement team at exactly 9:12 in the morning. I know that sounds incredibly dramatic, but when you actually dissect the precise sequence of events here, you realize instantly that this wasn't some petty family argument that accidentally got out of hand over dinner. This was a surgical, militaristic operation planned down to the exact minute. It was funded entirely through independent, untouchable channels, and it was designed specifically to blindly bypass every single courtier or advisor who might have tipped off the Queen Consort about the nightmare heading her way. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now because we are going to be unpacking the fallout of this massive power shift for a very long time. The constitutional implications alone are going to keep top-tier legal scholars sweating for the next decade. The dark family dynamics we are about to expose are the exact kind of secrets that usually stay buried in classified vaults for 50 years before historians are ever allowed to look at them. But this time, the impenetrable walls of the palace cracked, the details broke in real time, and the picture they paint is genuinely staggering. To truly understand how a family dispute turned into a massive high court raid, you have to start with a very specific, incredibly valuable object. There is a piece of jewelry known as the Sapphire Jubilee Snowflake Brooch. It is a breathtaking artifact, commissioned with 48 incredibly rare sapphires sourced directly from Baffin Island, surrounded by more than 400 flawless polar diamonds. It was created specifically to honor the late Queen Elizabeth II. We are talking about a singular piece valued at roughly £24.5 million. That price tag immediately tells you this isn't something you just casually toss into a jewelry box and forget about. This was a formal diplomatic gift from the Government of Canada in 2017. That means it belongs entirely to the institution of the Crown, absolutely not to any individual person currently breathing in the royal family. That specific legal distinction is going to become extremely dangerously important in just a minute. I really want to emphasize that word institution, because it is the entire concrete foundation of everything that follows. The Crown is not a living person. It is not a blended family. It is a massive legal entity that holds historical property in sacred trust for the entire nation. And that state property cannot be privately owned. It cannot be privately transferred as a favor. And it absolutely cannot be privately hidden in someone's suburban sitting room. But that is exactly what someone tried to do. During the massive, highly complex administrative reorganization of 2022, the palace was frantically moving tens of thousands of priceless artifacts between various royal residences. It was a huge infrastructure overhaul, and during that chaos, something incredibly valuable went missing. Specifically, that £24 million snowflake brooch. According to the highly classified files leaked from Windsor Box 11A, this masterpiece didn't just accidentally slip behind a cabinet or get misplaced in a dusty storage room. It was quietly, intentionally removed from the secure archives entirely. There was zero paperwork filed. There were no signed transfer logs. There was absolutely no tracking data. There was just an empty, velvet-lined slot where a massive national treasure used to securely sit. And the person who allegedly removed it was Queen Camilla's own sister. We are talking about a private, everyday civilian with exactly zero constitutional standing and absolutely zero royal security clearance. She apparently gained completely unauthorized access to the highly secure vaults during that chaotic transition period and physically transported the brooch directly to her private residence. Let the sheer audacity of that sink in for a moment. A private citizen casually walked into one of the most highly secure, heavily guarded archival facilities on the planet, physically removed a diplomatic gift worth more than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes, and carried it right out the front door without a single document being filed or an alarm being raised. That is not a small administrative oversight or a clumsy mistake. That is a fundamental, catastrophic breakdown of institutional security at a level that would trigger massive federal investigations in literally any other context. This is the exact point where the official narrative stops making any logical sense. The inventory tracking systems utilized by the Royal Collection Trust are not exactly casual clipboards. These are rigorously cross-referenced, highly digitized archives with security protocols that have been relentlessly perfected for generations. Every single item is meticulously catalogued, photographed from every angle, condition reported, and tracked through a strict chain of custody that would make a nuclear facility jealous. The terrifying idea that a single item of this immense value could just casually walk out of the building without anyone noticing for months suggests one of two extremely dark possibilities. Either the absolute chaos of the 2022 transition created an operational gap so massive that basic, fundamental security completely collapsed, or someone deep inside the system deliberately looked the other way. And honestly, neither of those options is great for the survival of the institution. If it was just pure chaos, then the palace was running a multi-million-pound relocation project with security protocols so dangerously porous that a civilian could essentially shoplift a national treasure. If it was deliberate, then someone with high-level access and authority actively facilitated the removal. That means the corruption goes far deeper than just one greedy person and extends directly into the administrative machinery itself. Either way, the Royal Collection Trust had a catastrophic failure on its hands, and someone was eventually going to have to answer for it. But Camilla's camp apparently believed they had successfully gotten away with the perfect heist. They clearly assumed the entire system was too distracted by the multi-million-pound relocation project and the shifting of power to ever notice a single missing item. And for a while, that arrogant assumption actually held up. The brooch sat in a private home, completely hidden from the world, with zero official record of its actual location. The faction felt entirely secure in what they had done. They probably rationalized it to themselves, saying it was just temporary, or that with so much wealth laying around, no one would ever actually miss it. They assumed the chaos of the transition would swallow the glaring discrepancy forever. But what they didn't know is that their quiet, illegal displacement of state property had already been logged. Princess, and acting with absolute authority in her role with the Royal Collection Trust, had quietly initiated an independent, relentless forensic audit of the entire state property collection. And when you do a forensic audit of that massive scale, you don't just walk around counting what's sitting on the shelves. You aggressively cross-reference every single item against decades of historical records, original provenance papers, and previous inventory documentation. You go back 50 years. You trace every single acquisition, every transfer, every loan, every exhibition. The glaring discrepancy was going to surface eventually. It was just a matter of time. And Princess, and out of everyone in the entire world, is the absolute last person you want conducting an audit of your hidden mistakes. She is brutally methodical. She is relentless. And she has absolutely zero tolerance for sloppiness, entitlement, or dishonesty when it comes to the institutions she fiercely serves. When the missing brooch finally surfaced on her radar, Camilla panicked. This is where the story takes a dark turn that genuinely exposes the terrifying reality of palace politics. Because the panic response wasn't to return the brooch quietly, apologize profusely, and beg for forgiveness. The panic response was to double down and attempt to aggressively rewrite reality itself. King Charles has been heavily recovering from severe medical treatments. This means there have been prolonged periods where he has been much less accessible, vastly less involved in day-to-day operations, and presumably highly reliant on the people immediately surrounding him. Camilla, according to these explosive reports, deliberately entered his highly restricted private quarters during one of these incredibly vulnerable periods. She didn't go in to check on his health. She went in with documents already drawn up for a $12.5 million protective directive. The grand idea was to manipulate the king into providing his personal signature on paperwork that would officially grant her sister sovereign immunity. This document would reclassify the stolen brooch as a permanent, personal gift rather than a piece of stolen state property. She was essentially attempting to use the king's massive sovereign authority to retroactively sanitize what would otherwise be considered a massive civil crime. And she did this while he was deeply recovering from medical treatment, isolated in his private quarters, using documents that had been highly prepared in advance by her own legal team. I need you to truly understand how incredibly serious that action is. That is not a simple misunderstanding over an inheritance. That is not a polite family favor. That is a deeply calculated, cold-blooded attempt to use a vulnerable sovereign's personal authority to override the legal status of state property. Let's just stop and think about the pure logic here for a second. If the brooch was legitimately acquired in the first place, Why on earth would you need a retroactive protective directive? If everything was completely above board from the very beginning, there would be massive amounts of paperwork showing authorized transfer, authorized removal, and authorized possession. The undeniable fact that they felt the need to manufacture documentation after the fact tells you absolutely everything you need to know about whether the original removal was legal. You simply do not create immunity documents for things that were done properly the first time. The very existence of that protective directive is a glaring, neon admission that the original action was completely indefensible. You don't run into a burning building and then frantically try to buy fire insurance while the roof is collapsing. You buy insurance long before the fire ever starts. The sequence of events here is completely backwards in a way that only makes sense if you know you have been totally caught and you are scrambling to build a frantic legal fortress around something that was never legally yours. But Camilla's biggest miscalculation wasn't the fraudulent paperwork itself. It was her arrogant assumption about exactly who would find out and what they would actually do about it. She fully expected the traditional palace network to operate exactly the way it always has for the last century. Quietly bury the discrepancy, prioritize the illusion of family harmony over actual legal accountability, and make the whole messy thing disappear behind heavily closed doors. That is exactly how the British monarchy has handled massive internal scandals for generations. You protect the core family, you protect the image of the institution, and you absolutely make sure nothing ever reaches the public or the unforgiving courts. The vast machinery of discretion usually kicks in, the expensive lawyers have quiet, hushed conversations, the press office issues carefully worded, confusing non-denials, and eventually the whole thing fades into the background noise of royal history. That exact playbook worked flawlessly for decades. It worked through massive affairs, through severe financial improprieties, and through all manner of dark personal misconduct. The arrogant assumption was that it would simply work again. What she tragically failed to account for is that the modern monarchy, operating under the iron grip of Prince William, absolutely does not operate that way anymore. And that massive failure of imagination is probably the single most consequential, devastating error of her entire tenure as Queen Consort. At exactly 8:43 in the morning, a highly secure phone call took place between Princess Anne and Prince William. It lasted exactly 9 minutes, and in those agonizing 9 minutes, the entire trajectory of this crisis violently shifted from a quiet family matter to a brutal, corporate-style legal enforcement action. Princess Anne flatly and aggressively refused to honor the protective directive. She stated explicitly to William that national diplomatic gifts absolutely cannot be treated as private currency to be handed out to relatives. She reiterated that the sovereign holds these treasures in a sacred public trust for the nation, and that the entire concept of personal ownership regarding this specific item is completely invalid under the constitutional framework. She didn't just complain. She took action. She compiled a massive, definitive evidentiary dossier. This included the original inventory records, the historical provenance papers, the damning forensic audit trail, absolutely everything. And then she drove directly to Kensington Palace to deliver the radioactive files to William personally. Not electronically where they could be intercepted. Not through intermediaries who could be bribed or pressured. She physically transported the evidence herself. That alone tells you exactly how seriously she was taking the chain of custody, and how incredibly little she trusted the normal, compromised channels of palace communication. She did not notify the king's office. She did not consult with Camilla's sprawling legal team. She completely bypassed the compromised administrative channels entirely. And when William sat down and reviewed the undeniable proof of what had happened, he didn't treat it as a delicate domestic issue to be smoothed over. He treated it as a direct, hostile assault on the integrity of the state. William's immediate response was terrifying in its cold efficiency. He ordered his personal legal team to coordinate directly with civil authorities and authorized an immediate, highly aggressive legal shutdown of the Queen Consort's extended family. The language utilized in the internal communications is apparently completely unambiguous. This was not characterized as a petty family dispute requiring mediation or therapy. It was strictly characterized as an unauthorized appropriation of state assets requiring immediate, brutal legal remedy. The framing of the situation is everything. Once you legally define the problem as a severe violation rather than a family disagreement, the entire response structure violently changes. There is absolutely no compromise. There is no polite negotiation. There is only swift, unforgiving enforcement. This is the exact part where I genuinely had to stop and reread the timeline because the sheer speed of this escalation is remarkable. William didn't slowly go through the standard, agonizing palace bureaucracy. He immediately activated the autonomous financial machinery of the Duchy of Cornwall, a massive entity which operates entirely outside the statutory control of the sovereign grant. By using those completely independent funds, he hired an elite team of high court legal specialists. Directly, he removed the battle from the messy, emotional theater of family politics and placed it squarely into the ruthless arena of corporate litigation. There was no tense family meeting in a drawing room. There was no attempt at mediation. There was absolutely no warning given. There was no courtesy call to say, "We need to talk about this." There was just the cold, incredibly efficient machinery of legal enforcement grinding into motion, funded entirely by independent resources that no one in Camilla's camp could touch, see, or influence. And then William did something that I think is going to have massive ripple effects for decades to come. He utilized his power to create a brand new, highly secure entity called the Royal Heritage Trust. Under his direct, unquestionable mandate, the remaining priceless historical artifacts of Queen Elizabeth II, a stunning collection valued at over £30 million, were permanently, irrevocably transferred into this independent public trust. Because the trust is strictly regulated by the Independent Charity Commission under the Charities Act of 2011, it is legally, completely insulated from any royal intervention whatsoever. Absolutely no reigning monarch can alter its terms. No queen consort can ever manipulate its assets. No family connection or sweet-talking can grant access to its secure vaults. The possessions are now permanently, legally locked into the direct line of succession extending from William straight down to Prince George. The legal architecture of this trust is fascinating and brilliant. It is specifically designed to be entirely impervious to exactly the kind of desperate manipulation that Camilla just attempted. The trustees are fiercely independent, the charitable purpose is clearly defined by law, and the assets are registered and constantly monitored. Any attempt to alter the terms would require Charity Commission approval, which would instantly trigger massive public scrutiny and a severe legal review. It is, in effect, an impenetrable fortress built around the physical legacy of Elizabeth II, and Camilla has absolutely no key, no access, and no legal standing to even knock on the door. The exact moment that trust was finalized and legally binding on June 10, 2026, Camilla's highly desperate $12.5 million protective directive collapsed entirely into dust. It instantly had absolutely zero legal standing before the Charity Commission. It provided zero protection under civil law. It offered zero immunity for her scrambling inner circle. Her sister was transformed instantly, in the blink of an eye, from a highly protected palace relative into an ordinary, highly vulnerable civilian defendant facing severe high court penalties. The fraudulent paperwork Camilla had frantically manufactured in the king's private quarters was reduced to a useless stack of papers. All that effort, all that secretive scheming, all that dark exploitation of a vulnerable moment, and it evaporated the instant the trust became operational. The protective directive wasn't just politely rejected. It was rendered completely, legally irrelevant. It was a dead document that purported to grant sweeping immunity over assets that simply no longer existed in any form that the directive could legally reach. The brooch was no longer floating in a murky gray area of palace ownership. It was locked tightly in a trust, and trusts absolutely do not answer to protective directives signed in private quarters. So, let's talk about what actually went down on the morning of June 10th. A fast-moving convoy of unmarked enforcement vehicles turned onto the quiet, highly affluent residential street of Camilla's sister. At exactly 9:12 a.m., the High Court enforcement team arrived at the property, heavily armed with an emergency asset recovery mandate that completely bypassed the standard palace bureaucracy. They had exactly 37 minutes to secure, rigorously inventory, and physically remove the snowflake brooch from the residence. And they did exactly that. There was absolutely no negotiation. There was no backroom compromise. There was zero opportunity for Camilla's camp to intervene, make phone calls, or delay the process. The enforcement team had an ironclad court order, a strict, unforgiving time window, and a mandate that definitively did not include making courtesy phone calls to the palace to ask if anyone wanted to object. They entered the property, they precisely located the item, they meticulously documented its condition, they securely locked it away, and they left. 37 minutes. That is vastly less time than most people spend on their morning commute. And in that tiny window, the entire towering edifice of Camilla's quiet power grab was completely dismantled by officers who probably had absolutely no idea they were executing one of the most significant, highly sensitive asset recoveries in modern royal history. But here is the truly terrifying thing. The actual physical recovery of the brooch wasn't even the devastating part. The truly devastating part was exactly what happened immediately afterward. The entire palace press office was placed under an absolute, ironclad lockdown by direct order of Kensington Palace. The traditional, massive machinery of public relations was completely paralyzed. There was no explanation offered to reporters. There was no spinning press release. There was no attempt to control the narrative. There was just an intentional, deafening silence that allowed the brutal legal action to speak entirely for itself. William deliberately and coldly denied Camilla's camp any opportunity whatsoever to alter the narrative or negotiate a quiet, face-saving family settlement behind closed doors. The press office, which had spent decades expertly managing public perception of massive royal scandals, was explicitly told to say absolutely nothing. Not a carefully worded, vague statement. Not a subtle reference to internal matters. Nothing. The utter silence was the message. And in that terrifying silence, the only story was the one written by the cold, hard legal facts. A high court enforcement team had forcefully recovered state property from the home of the Queen consort's sister, and absolutely no one in the palace was offering any alternative explanation. And then Catherine, Princess of Wales, delivered the ultimate, silent killing blow. She stepped out for a highly photographed, incredibly high-profile diplomatic state engagement. Pinned firmly and perfectly to her formal ceremonial attire was the freshly repossessed sapphire Jubilee snowflake brooch. Its 48 rare Baffin Island sapphires and more than 400 polar diamonds were flashing brilliantly under the cameras for the entire world to see. There was absolutely no accompanying announcement from the palace staff. There was no official commentary provided to the hungry media. Catherine simply wore the recovered national treasure exactly as if it were the most natural progression in royal history. The cameras caught it, the fashion commentators noted it, the diplomatic observers deeply understood it, and not a single word was spoken by anyone in an official capacity. That visual statement is honestly brutal when you actually think about it. The silent, undeniable message was delivered to every single foreign dignitary and palace official with absolute, terrifying clarity. The treasure had been successfully repossessed, carefully archived, and permanently secured within the direct, legitimate line of succession. Camilla had to sit there and watch that highly public display, knowing deep down that her desperate attempt to manipulate the system had only violently accelerated her own structural exile. She couldn't issue a furious statement. She couldn't spin the narrative to friendly tabloids. She couldn't do anything but watch the future queen, where the undeniable evidence of her faction's massive defeat on international television. Every single flash of those polar diamonds was a glaring reminder that her reach had been completely severed, her influence had been entirely nullified, and her sister was now facing the severe legal consequences of actions that Camilla herself had orchestrated in an attempt to run the cover-up. What makes this entire situation so unprecedented is not just the fascinating legal mechanics. It is the complete and total abandonment of the traditional palace playbook. For decades, the survival of the crown relied heavily on quiet compromises made behind heavily closed doors. If a prominent relative violated the law, the palace machinery quietly neutralized the consequences. The public never found out. The courts never got involved. The illusion of family harmony was preserved at the immense expense of institutional integrity. That was the unspoken bargain. The family protected its members, and in return, the members kept their massive scandals quiet enough that the public never had to confront the ugly gap between the idealized monarchy and the messy, corrupt reality. It was a system built entirely on discretion, on mutual obligation, and on the dark understanding that the institution's survival depended on keeping certain things permanently out of view. William just established an entirely different, terrifying precedent. The rule of law applies universally. Blood ties will no longer buy you protection from state enforcement teams. If you misappropriate national assets, you will face the exact same legal consequences as any other civilian, regardless of who your sister happens to be married to. That is a revolutionary, massive change in the operating philosophy of the British monarchy. It boldly states that the institution's legitimacy depends not on protecting its elite members from consequences, but on brutally demonstrating that no one is above the legal framework that governs everyone else. This is a massive gamble of immense proportions